Imagine a man everyone knows and almost no one truly knows. His name is on front pages, his face is hardened into a logo, and his home has turned into a set for an endless parade of jokes and horror stories. People talk about him as if he were not a person, but a genre. For some, he is a savior. For others, a threat to democracy. For others still, a walking meme. His name is Donald Trump. But to tell his story, I want to begin with another man, someone who died 190 years before Trump was even born. 2 centuries before Twitter, before TV shows and skyscrapers with his name in giant letters on the roof, there lived in London a prince who was also seen as the shame of the nation and at the same time its public face. He loved gold, extravagance, foreign styles, grand building projects and expensive pleasures. Caricaturists made fortunes off him, intellectuals groaned with embarrassment. Part of the public admired him, another part despised him. His name was George, Prince of Wales, later King George IV. They are divided by an ocean, by monarchy and republic, by powder and television, by carriages and private jets. And yet, if you strip away the cut of the fashionable trousers and the thickness of the gilding, their biographies begin to rhyme in disturbingly tight patterns. In both cases, we see the heir to a particular world, a son of a normal age who grows up and suddenly starts behaving as if the rules were never meant for him. We see a man who turns power into an extension of his own taste, into architecture, into clothing, into a tone of voice, into a media persona. And we see a society that both feeds off this spectacle and claims to hate it. A society that laughs at the fat king or the orange president and still cannot tear its gaze away. In this episode, I want to look at Donald Trump through the eyes of a historian who is used to dealing with princes' diaries, parliamentary debates, and the venomous caricatures of the Regency era. And at the same time, to look at George IV through the eyes of a 21st century observer who understands how a media scandal works, how show politicians are grown, and why show politicians can sometimes be more frightening than the most serious men of state. We are not here to decide which of them is worse or more dangerous. This is not a trial and not a campaign video. It is an attempt to understand why, again and again in history, figures appear who irritate respectable people and yet become almost perfect mirrors of their own time. And we will not begin with the White House or a tower in New York City. We will begin with a young man in the late 18th century who does not yet wear a crown, but already lives as if the country existed to pay for his taste. Chapter 1. The Golden Boy of Empire, the Making of George IV. If you have ever seen a full state portrait of George IV, the kind where he stands swathed in velvet and fur, dripping with orders, crown and scepters, you may well have thought you were looking at a caricature. It is all so excessive, so theatrical, almost indecently bright. But at the end of the 18th century, this is not a joke, it is reality. The British monarchy has just suffered a bitter humiliation. Under his father, George III, the empire lost its American colonies. The country has passed through a series of crises and wars. Against that backdrop, the eldest son, the Prince of Wales, looks like a challenge to everything associated with the virtuous king. George III is almost a cartoon of the family man. Strict, religious, thrifty, predictable. George the son is his opposite. His balconies, his wardrobe, his dinners, and his love affairs are discussed in London as eagerly as the news from Paris or Vienna. From the very beginning, he has everything one can be given by birth: title, money, a court, attention. And he treats it all as rich heirs in any age tend to do, as a resource for pleasure. In his youth, George turns his own life into an unending party. His circle includes actresses, dandies, gamblers,
artists, adventurers, people we would now call influencers if only they knew how to run an Instagram account. He runs up debts that astonish even his wealthy contemporaries. Parliament seriously debates whether to rescue him at the taxpayer's expense, much as today societies debate whether states should bail out banks or corporations that are too big to fail. The underlying theme of his youth is display. Look how I live. New carriages, new interiors, new outfits, everything new and as spectacular as possible. And here it is hard not to think of another man who spent decades building a career on showing the public, look, this is how the successful live. This is what a real winner looks like. Before the presidency, Donald Trump was known for precisely this. He sold not so much property as an image. Gold railings, marble, huge letters with his name on the facade. This is not just taste, it is a language. Trump, like George, speaks to the world in gilded phrases. But let us return to late 18th century London. For George, simply being rich is not enough. He wants to be a style icon, the man who decides how one ought to dress, how a house should be arranged, how one should take one's pleasures. He surrounds himself with people who know how to turn taste into fashion, tailors, painters, architects. They do with him what advertising agencies and stylists later do with modern celebrities. They create a brand. This is how his first real media product appears. Not a TV show, but a house. In a small seaside resort, Brighton, something begins to rise that even his contemporaries struggled to take entirely seriously. A palace in an oriental style, with domes, minarets, dragons, Chinese and Indian motifs all mixed into a chaotic but striking whole. The Royal Pavilion is not just a country house, it is one man's taste made solid and pushed into grotesque. It is his version of what Trump, 2 centuries later, will call Trump Tower and Mar-a-Lago. The pavilion immediately becomes a point of contention. For some, it is the height of refinement, a bold experiment, a willingness to break dreary norms. For others, it is outrageous bad taste, Eastern kitsch, unworthy of a serious power. But however fiercely they argue about taste, everyone is talking about the same man, and that is exactly what he needs. Already we can see an important pattern emerging. George IV builds architecture not only out of stone and timber, but out of attention. Every column, every dome is not just a piece of a building, it is a brick in his image. The parallel with Trump lies not in stylistic detail, but in logic. Both men use property as an extension of the self and as a media platform. Trump Tower is not just offices and apartments, it is a permanent backdrop for shots, interviews, book covers, logos. The Brighton Pavilion is not just a house, it is a stage on which George plays the role of the king who truly knows how to live. Both men grasp early that power is not only about documents, it is about the gaze. Whoever has learned to command the gaze will find it much easier to command people. Long before he is king, George lives as the main character of political prints. Artists draw him constantly, fat, sweating, overdressed, surrounded by bottles and women. James Gillray and other satirists turn him into a monster of appetite and libido, just as 21st century cartoonists and meme makers have defined the visual canon of Trump, the orange tint, the hair, the grimaces, the hand gestures. And just when it seems all of this is merely about the private life of a spoiled prince, history makes a turn. His father's illness and the European wars force him to put on another mask.
Chapter 2. The Prince Regent, when private life becomes a national show. By the time George has turned Brighton into his personal set,
The world beyond his private theater is anything but festive. Europe is splitting at the seams with revolutions and wars. France has executed a king. Napoleon is on the rise. Borders are shifting. States are dying and being born anew. And in London, an event occurs that will reshape not only the dynasty's fate, but George's own. His father, George III, is gradually losing his mind. At first, fits, oddities, incoherent speeches. Then it becomes clear. The king is no longer capable of ruling. For the British system, a favorite target of Enlightenment jokes, this is a serious challenge. The country must be governed without destroying the idea of monarchy. The solution is a compromise, a regency. Formally, the king lives, but power passes to his eldest son. Thus, instead of the golden boy who loves balls, the country acquires a man who must become the effective ruler of an empire without waiting for a formal coronation. This is the moment when the prince's private story becomes a public affair. One might expect George to see this as an opportunity to rewrite his biography, to leave behind the reputation of a wastrel and enter history as a serious statesman. But by then, he already carries something his contemporaries would have called a time bomb. His personal life has long since ceased to be just a subject for gossip and become a political problem. Back in his youth, long before the Regency, George took a step that looks at once deeply human and recklessly irresponsible for an heir to the throne. He secretly married a woman whom, by law, he had no right to take as his wife. Her name was Maria Fitzherbert. She was a Catholic, and that is the key point. Under British law at the time, an heir to the throne could not marry a Catholic without risking his very right to the crown. In strictly legal terms, the secret marriage to Maria doesn't quite count, but in human terms, it is a very serious statement. The prince is effectively saying, my private life matters more than the laws of the state. It is almost a teenage gesture performed by a grown man. Contempt for rules and the calm conviction that the system will swallow it. Here, a quiet parallel suggests itself with another man who, making deals, contracts, and marriages, has repeatedly shown the conviction that laws are something to be left to the lawyers afterwards. Very often, Donald Trump behaves as if frameworks and norms exist for others, but not for him. Bank loans, tax arrangements, corporate shells, he treats them all, above all, as a playing field, where the main thing is to feel exactly how far you can bend a rule without formally breaking it. George does the same thing, only in an 18th century monarchy. He enters into a marriage he takes seriously emotionally and morally, yet chooses to treat legally as if it had never happened. At the time, it strikes him as an elegant solution. A few years later, it turns into a political trap. Because when the question of the next queen arises, the country does not need the prince's secret love. It needs an official union. Ideally, one that is dynastically useful, religiously safe, morally respectable. So another woman appears on the horizon, Caroline of Brunswick. The prince is far from delighted. She does not fit his aesthetic or personal expectations. But the dynasty, the ministers, the diplomats need not feelings but a contract. What follows is something that has happened many times in royal houses. The marriage is given the green light almost irrespective of the attraction or revulsion of bride and groom. And here, George acts as a man long accustomed to sacrificing inner conflict to outward splendor. He marries and will go on paying for that ceremony for decades. The wedding to Caroline is not the beginning of a love story. It is the beginning of a national farce. Almost immediately after the ceremony, they begin to hate one another, sincerely and energetically. They criticize each other's appearance, manners, habits, and they do this not in private diaries, but through friends, servants, courtiers, that is, through people who live by repeating stories. Personal dislike very quickly becomes a political topic. What ought to have remained a private matter of the royal family lands in the center of public attention. Pamphlets, caricatures, jokes proliferate. Court factions use the conflict between the prince and his wife as a convenient instrument. Some back Caroline as the wronged woman, others the prince, supposedly the victim of an unfortunate match. Every camp has its own interests, its own calculations. Seen through the lens of the 21st century, the whole thing looks uncomfortably like an overlong reality show. We have a wealthy man with very specific taste, a woman who does not fit his ideal image, a rupture, mutual hatred, and an audience avidly watching to see whose version of the story will win the information war. Late 20th and early 21st century American culture is thoroughly used to such spectacles. Divorces, explosive accusations, press conferences framed as he said, she said are almost a separate entertainment genre. The story of Trump's marriages, his public comments about his ex-wives, sometimes delivered in the tone of a corporate presentation, function in much the same way. What in a normal life would remain between two people and their lawyers becomes part of the public persona, part of the brand. The difference is that in George IV's era, the roles of tabloids and talk shows are played by pamphlets, caricature sheets, and drawing room talk. Otherwise, the mechanics are the same. Society takes someone else's intimate life and turns it into a serial for collective viewing.
By the time George becomes Prince Regent, his marriage to Caroline is already in tatters. They live apart, exchange barbs through the papers and their entourages, and from time to time through palace scenes. The most painful element of this story is their daughter. Princess Charlotte is George's only legitimate child, the hope of the dynasty, a future queen. Her fate too becomes a battlefield. Who will influence her? Who will raise her? Who will win the public sympathy, father or mother? What should have been a delicate conversation about how estranged parents share custody turns into a semi-official spectacle. Every decision touching Princess Charlotte immediately sprouts rumors and commentary. Here the modern echo is bitter. When people today discuss Trump's relationships with his children, the perceived successes and failures of his sons and daughter, their hesitations and gestures in public appearances, they often forget that these are also living people. What is discussed is not their character, but the degree to which they fit or do not fit the image their father has built around himself. The most dramatic act in George and Caroline's drama will unfold later, when he is king and tries formally to divorce her, strip her of title, and bar her from his coronation. Crowds will take to the streets, newspapers will split into hostile camps, and the world will watch with fascination as a king wages open war on his own wife. But even at the regency stage, one thing is already clear. The heir's private life has ceased to be private. It has become an arena on which society works through its fears, its moral poses, its double standards, and its hunger for spectacle. Here it is very important not to confuse cause and effect. In both our stories, London in the 19th century and Washington in the 21st, it is easy to cast the loud, scandal-prone, combative man as the main author of chaos. But without an environment ready to fund and applaud each new twist of the drama, neither George nor Trump could have remained center stage for so long. The Prince Regent lives in a country where newspapers, artists, politicians, and ordinary readers all derive pleasure from condemning and mocking their future king, while never taking their eyes off him. In exactly the same way, today's media world earns clicks, ratings, and profit from every new phrase, every photo, every fresh outburst of anger or ill-judged joke from Donald Trump. A man with such traits becomes an ideal supplier of content, and as long as he is profitable, it is very difficult for society to ask in earnest what price does the state pay for all this, when its highest office becomes an endless series. Against that backdrop, one word in George's title sounds particularly odd:
regent from the Latin to rule. His life seems to be ruled by almost everyone but himself, by courtly expectations, dynastic needs, greedy creditors, and, not least, the insatiable appetite of the public for scandal. Later, when he finally becomes king, one more layer will be added to this circus, the question of what he actually did for his country in politics, and not just in anecdotes. But to understand how dangerous the combination of real power and the reputation of a frivolous man can be, we will have to leave his bedroom and look into Parliament and, briefly at least, onto the battlefield.
Chapter 3. A King Without Respect. Politics, War, and an Empire Behind the Caricature. By this point, our hero is tired of being the Prince Regent. He has lived through long years of a double existence, formally not a king, in practice running the country in place of a father sinking deeper into illness. His private life is one continuous scandal. Caricatures show him drunk or choking in his tight uniform. And yet the British machine keeps working. Prime ministers succeed one another, Parliament argues, the army fights Napoleon, the fleet patrols the seas. Then, in 1820, when George is already over 50, his father dies. The transition the country has been preparing for over decades finally happens. The regent becomes King George IV. On paper, this is a moment of triumph. The man who has so long played the ruler in the half-light can at last legitimately put on the crown. The reality is far more prosaic and far less triumphant. By now, common sense suggests that the empire needs a monarch capable of consolidating it after the shocks of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic era, of giving a tired society a sense of stability. Instead, the country gets a king whom many see as the symbol of everything that is wrong with it. It is important to understand that George's regency fell in years when the very existence of the British Empire in its current form was at stake. The wars with Napoleon were not simply another conflict in Europe. They posed the risk that France might finally push Britain off the continent, impose its own rules, and undermine British trade and prestige. The names that history tends to remember from these years are others: William Pitt the Younger, the Duke of Wellington, generals, admirals, ministers. They're the ones making the decisions that lead to Waterloo and Napoleon's final defeat. Next to them, George looks distinctly like a second-tier figure. He is not a strategist, not a reformer, not a soldier. He's the man ostentatiously parading greatness at balls, while someone else defends that greatness in mud and blood. Here, the similarity becomes hard to ignore. When Donald Trump becomes president, the United States has long been a superpower with a vast, intricate, and inertial machine of governance: the National Security Council, the Pentagon, the intelligence community, Congress. Many of the decisions that shape the world are taken not in the Oval Office, but several floors below, on the basis of documents, doctrines, and forecasts. In such a setting, a president with a vivid, combative, media-heavy style can easily become a figure whose real influence is constantly at odds with his symbolic image. For many people, Trump is not a set of specific laws and orders, but a stream of tweets, rallies, and scandals. With George IV, something very similar happens. His reign coincides with crucial developments for Britain: post-war economic restructuring, the rise of cities and industry, the first serious debates on parliamentary reform, the expansion of empire in India and elsewhere. Yet, when a 19th-century historian or a modern school student hears George IV, they tend to recall not statutes and reforms, but an overweight monarch in an absurd uniform and his never-ending war with his wife.
It is an easy perspective and a treacherous one. Real power rarely disappears just because a frivolous man sits at the top. It simply flows to other figures. Under George IV, the country is effectively steered by prime ministers and ministers who often regard him with thinly disguised contempt, but understand that his signature still carries weight. Between him and the government, there is a constant bargaining over appointments, over policy directions, over private indulgences. The king can block and delay decisions, using quiet periods not to think about the common good, but to extract another payment on his debts or to press for yet another residence. So even as an object of ridicule, he remains a dangerous player, capricious, vindictive, capable of wrecking an important decision out of personal dislike. In the United States, a similar question was asked during and after Trump's presidency. If a man whom part of the political class sees as unprepared and unsystematic gains access to the nuclear briefcase, to executive orders, to judicial appointments, exactly how does the system restrain him, and how does it enable him? Where do we draw the line between clown and genuine source of danger? In both cases, the answer is uncomfortable. Neither George nor Trump was simply a bulb on the throne. Yes, they were constrained by advisors, ministers, courts, legislatures, but at key moments they could change the course of foreign policy, pressure their own side, promote or stall reforms, set the tone in which the country looked at itself. The age of George IV is not only an age of balls and cartoons, it is also an age of sharp conflicts over Catholic emancipation, over what rights Catholics should have in a Protestant Britain. In that story, the king is no mere bystander. His personal attitudes, his fears, his prejudices affect how quickly the country is willing to recognize new rights for those it sees as other. Britain does, in the end, make it through that struggle, but every step is hard won, and George's figure becomes a convenient target. It is easy to pin all resistance on the man whose image already irritates everyone. In recent American history, we see a similar phenomenon. Any decision on migration, climate, or international agreements under Trump is automatically colored by his personal style. Real, complex debates about borders, jobs, sovereignty are drowned out by shouting about walls, by tweets, by caps with slogans. For supporters and opponents alike, it becomes easier to talk not about policy, but about personality.
Another shared layer is the question of respect, not respect as a private emotion, but as a vital element of authority. A king is supposed, in theory, to embody the dignity of the state. So is the president of a great republic. When such positions are filled by men the elite freely mocks, something more dangerous than mere fun begins. Subjects and citizens start to grow used to the idea that supreme power is always, in some sense, slightly ridiculous. Parody displaces seriousness. This does not mean that before George all monarchs were saints, or that before Trump presidents were never mocked. But in both cases, the degree of open contempt from educated circles is unprecedented. Contemporaries wrote of George with undisguised hatred, lazy, vain, the most detested of English kings. Of Trump, a large part of the American academic and media world speaks in much the same terms. Shame, disaster, a disgraceful episode in history. And here, history once again displays its dark humor. The more he is hated, the more convenient he becomes as an explanation for an entire age. Blaming one bad king for Britain's slow response to social problems is comfortable and dishonest. So is blaming the crisis of American institutions on a single figure in the White House. It is far harder to admit that such people reach the top not in spite of the state of society, but because of it. Behind their excesses lies a real demand from part of the population for conspicuous wealth, for simple answers instead of complex, for a real man instead of gray bureaucrats. George IV did not fall on Britain from the sky.
He grew inside a system that rewarded aristocratic idle splendor and closed its eyes to private vices until it was too late. Trump is not an accidental guest in American politics. Behind him lie decades of success worship, reality TV, slogans about winners and losers, and a deep fatigue in parts of society with cautious, compromise-seeking leaders. In this sense, the era of George the King is a mirror in which we see not only his face, but the shape of his Britain. And the years of Trump's presidency are a mirror reflecting less his individual biography than the condition of the United States on the threshold of a new decade. To make that mirror still harsher, we need one more step: to place side by side two men who at first glance live in different universes, but in whose gestures, phrases, and decors a recognizable common handwriting suddenly appears. In the next chapter, we will try to do precisely that: to look at Donald Trump not as a scrolling newsfeed, but as the kind of figure a 19th century historian would instantly recognize among his own kings and princes. If we look at Donald Trump not through the eyes of an angry voter or an ardent supporter, but through the eyes of a historian accustomed to 18th and 19th century portraiture, he stops looking like a unique phenomenon. In his biography, in his gestures and his decor, familiar lines begin to show, lines that were once drawn in the life of the English Prince Regent, the future George IV. Not because they look alike on the surface, but because both belong to the same type of power, a power that turns a country into an extension of one man's taste and one man's show. George grew up in a world where status was granted by birth, not earned at the ballot box. But inheritance alone does not make a man the figure of an age. For his name to be known and argued over beyond official papers, he has to become a story, the subject of conversation, of jokes, of admiration, and of scandal. The regent does this in the way he knows how, with noise, with glitter, with broken expectations. He turns every aspect of his life into a pretext to talk about him, from his wardrobe to his buildings. The Brighton Pavilion, with its impossible domes, oriental kitsch, dragons, and pseudo-Persian motifs, is not just a house, it is a visual cry: look at me, I am not like you, I live in another dimension of luxury. His contemporaries wince, the artistic and political elites whisper about vulgarity and waste, but they look, and that, for George, is what counts. Trump achieves the same effect in another medium. He is not born a prince, but he is born with money and with a name that opens doors. That is enough to become a rich man, not enough to become a symbol. He becomes a symbol when he turns a business into a brand, and the brand into a perpetual media storyline. Skyscrapers and hotels carrying his name, gold interiors, marble, mirrors, these are the same architectural phrases as the domes George built in Brighton. They say the same thing to the world. This is what success looks like. This is the summit. And just as in early 19th century London, part of the audience responds to that cry with disgust and part with delight, seeing in it confirmation of their own myth. If I ever get rich, my life will look just like this. Both men come to supreme office with a fully formed sense that the world is a stage and they are its leading man. For years, George exists as Prince Regent, a man who is not yet king but already governs on behalf of a sick father. Around him orbit shoals of flatterers, artists, favorites, creditors. He is accustomed to the idea that every whim will be discussed and gratified. He lives wrapped in a dense cloud of attention, from newspapers, from the court, from the street. It seems natural to him that his taste decides what is fashionable, and that his private life is raw material for pamphlets. When he finally places the crown on his head, he does not reinvent himself for the role of monarch. He merely scales up the familiar part of the princely showman to the size of a kingdom. Trump does the same thing with different tools, not palaces and lithographs, but television and tabloids. The reality show in which he fires people under the stage lights to the applause of the audience is not a one-off role, but a long training ground. Years spent as the man whose "you're fired" is treated as final truth accustom him to the thought that his judgment is the last word. By the time he walks into the White House, the myth of the tough, successful deal-maker has been circling him for many years, and he believes in it no less than his viewers do. For him, the presidency is not so much a new profession as a new season of a long-running series. In both cases, real power is laid onto an already solidified role. Monarchical Britain and presidential America both like to think their institutions are dense and intricate enough to smooth out the quirks of any particular personality at the top. In London, imperial policy is set by prime ministers, the commons, generals. In Washington, a huge inertial machine of bureaucracy, courts, Congress, and security agencies grinds on daily work without waiting for the leader's constant presence. That creates a tempting illusion. You can treat the man at the summit as decoration, as a symbol, as a head on a banknote, and forget that symbols move and speak. On the face of it, George IV fits this harmless decoration role almost too well. Not especially bright, not especially industrious, fond of hunting, balls, and furnishings. But his private passions and sulks regularly intrude into the workings of the system. He can block decisions, delay reforms, insist on appointments out of personal liking. His stance on religion, on the rights of Catholics in Protestant Britain, slows a painful but necessary expansion of civil rights. His sharpened sense of personal offense prevents him from seeing political steps in any terms but for me or against me. And so, around him, the machinery of power develops an ever more complicated choreography. Ministers and MPs must not only do the empire's business, but constantly thread their way around the moods of the man upstairs. Trump's story is organized differently in its details, but the underlying logic is similar. He inherits not a throne, but a presidency in a country already burdened with a huge weight of unresolved tensions, economic, racial, cultural, geopolitical. His predecessors, however different, still shared a certain register, that careful bureaucratic idiom of late 20th century politics. Trump blows up that idiom quite deliberately. He speaks to the world as he once spoke to his reality show audience, quickly, coarsely, in broad strokes, guided less by policy papers than by a gut feeling that this will land.
And just as British ministers once winced at the regent's manners, the American establishment winces at Trump's tweets and speeches. But wincing does not alter a simple fact. He still signs documents, still appoints people, still has the power to change course. What most unites them, though, is not character, but function. George IV and Donald Trump become figures through whom their countries articulate long-stored tensions. Around George gathers resentment at idle aristocratic excess, hypocrisy, resistance to reform. Around Trump gathers resentment over economic inequality, the collapse of an older industrial America, demographic and cultural shifts. It is easy to hate both men, and easy, through that hatred, not to notice how deep the problems run in the body of society long before either man appears. When George dies, many contemporaries feel relief. It seems as if an awkward, shameful age of excess has finally passed. They write of him as a wasted talent, a man who might have been a great king and chose instead to be an aging dandy. Yet historically, he plays a less comfortable role. He exposes, to the point of embarrassment, the weaknesses and hypocrisies of his aristocracy.
After him, it becomes impossible in good faith to pretend that an elite living on credit and display can continue unchanged. The Victorian age, with its stress on morality and work, is in large part an answer to George's generation. The future will likely grant a similar distance around Trump. In books and monographs, he is unlikely to survive merely as an anecdote about the man with Twitter and odd hair. Far more likely, he will be described as a symptom, the concentrated expression of decades of success worship, television, reality show culture, and the erosion of trust in traditional institutions. As a figure who both exploited the system's weaknesses and helped to make those weaknesses visible. In that sense, to say Trump is George IV with Twitter would be too crude an oversimplification, but to place them side by side is useful. It makes it clear how, from time to time, history really does thrust to the top people whose lives are one long shop window, and then asks them to manage the warehouse where millions of other lives are stored. And each time, society pretends to be surprised. Yet if we rewind back to the Pavilion in Brighton and the golden elevators in New York, there is, in truth, very little left to be surprised about. That's all for today. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. There is much more to come.